number 4232 be called up.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and Mr. McCain, proposes an amendment numbered 4232.
I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
I'd ask that the pending amendment be set aside and amendment 4231 be called up.
Without objection, clerk will report.
Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and Mr. McCain, proposes an amendment numbered 4231.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
We have before us almost a $60 billion emergency supplemental appropriations bill. This is about the 8th supplemental bill that we have discussed since I've been in the Senate. Some appropriate, some not. But the thing that I think the American people need to know, given the fact that this week our debt will be $13 trillion, this week. That doesn't count what we owe trust funds inside the government. That doesn't count money we've stolen from Social Security. That doesn't count, that'll have to be paid back. It doesn't count money that's been taken from the Oil Recovery Fund that'll have to be paid back. It doesn't count the money from the Inland Waterway Trust Fund and all these other trust funds. That's $13 billion outside of what we've borrowed from ourselves, $13 trillion. And so we have before us a bill that is an emergency supplemental appropriations bill. And I thought it'd be interesting for the American people to see what the rules of the Senate say about what's an emergency. Because nobody can say the war is an emergency. Since September 11, 2001, there's been no emergency other than the fact that we knew we were going to war. And the fact is we've known that, at least for the last 5-6 years. Nobody can say that. But when you look at the definition that we're supposed to follow, our own rules about emergency designations, they have 5 characteristics. And those 5 characteristics is, one is it's necessary, it's essential, and it's vital. Well, some of this bill is necessary, some of it's essential, and some of it's vital. Not all of it is, by any means. Number 2 is sudden, quickly coming into being and not building up over time. Well, this bill certainly doesn't meet that requirement except for a very small section of it. An urgent, pressing, and compelling need requiring immediate action. There's no immediate action here on anything, except maybe the FEMA portion for both the upper Northeast and the flooding and Nashville, Tennessee and its flooding. But we have $900 million sitting in FEMA right now that hadn't been spent that we could start spending. So we don't have to pass $5 billion right now. Unforeseen, unpredictable, and unanticipated. Well, the war certainly isn't unforeseen. It certainly isn't unpredictable, and it certainly wasn't unanticipated. We've known it. So it certainly doesn't meet that definition. And it's not permanent, it's not temporary in nature. So we have what we're supposed to be following. And I would pretend that 98% of this bill doesn't meet the requirements of being an emergency designation. And yet, why are we calling it an emergency designation? There's one real reason for that. And that is we don't have to confine it in with the total amount that we're authorized to spend. This is outside what we're going to spend. It's $60 billion that we're going to borrow. We're going to borrow it. We're going to borrow it from the children of the people who are in Afghanistan and Iraq that are fighting this war. The people in this body aren't going to pay it back. We're going to kiss it goodbye and we're going to say, here's your present, grandchildren. Here's a present for the kids of the warfighter that's over there today, that's sacrificing, his family's sacrificing, her family's sacrificing, but we're going to borrow it from them. And it's not that we haven't done it. We had made a big fanfare about that we were going to institute PAYGO, that we weren't going to violate PAYGO, that PAYGO was going to force discipline on us. So we passed a statute. The president had a big signing, except here's what's happened since we've signed it. was signed into law on February 12th. On February 24th, we violated PAYGO. We said the rule doesn't apply, we have a need, we're going to spend $46 billion. So we spent $46 billion. Outside of the budget, we borrowed $46 billion. Whoops, March 2nd. Don't have the courage to eliminate lower priorities parts of the government, we borrowed another $10 billion. All of a sudden on the 3rd, then we borrowed $99 billion. PAYGO didn't count. We just said we waive PAYGO. 60 votes of the Senate, we have no fiscal discipline. $99 billion. April 14th, we borrowed $18 billion. Did it again. So if you add those up, and that doesn't count the last one that we did. I'll bring a more accurate chart tomorrow when I talk about the rest of these amendments. But so far, we've borrowed $173 billion when we said we weren't going to borrow money anymore because we're going to have PAYGO that says that'll force the discipline on us to put lower priorities off the spending line to put higher priorities on. So just since February 12th, it's now late May, we've borrowed $173 billion. We're going to add $60 billion here, and we've got a tax extender package that's coming with another $230 billion. That's $563 billion since February 12th that we're going to spend money. I understand the majority leader's on the floor. Would you like time, Mr. Leader?
I am here. We should have some. Why don't you proceed, and when I get the necessary...
I'll be happy to yield to the leader.
Thank you very much.
So $500 billion since we famously passed PAYGO, and we're going to waive it 6 times. And when we haven't waived it, we've declared something an emergency. So we don't have PAYGO law applying. The budget rules go out the window because it's an emergency. Except we don't meet the criteria for emergency by our own definition. So what's this all about? Is it about playing a shell game with the American people? To say we're going to do one thing and then turn around and inside before July 1st, in 5 months, less than 5 months, we're going to borrow another $500 billion after we tell the American people, oh no, we're not going to do that anymore. We have an emergency. There is no question this country has an emergency. And you know what it is? It's a $13 trillion debt that we have today that's going to be $23 trillion in 8 years from now. We have a debt that's going to suppress our GDP by 1.5% to 2%. And what we could normally grow because the government's debt is such a burgeoning hangover on the capital markets. And yet we don't have the ability to do what we promised the American people we would do. You know, I feel like I ought to read the signing statement of President Obama when he signed PAYGO, and the statements of all my colleagues that said this is the answer. Except that won't do any good. The only answer is for the American people to hold us accountable. I obviously can't. For 5.5 years, I've been trying to tamp down spending, to have us make a position that we're going to go to the lowest priority, cut the lowest priority out so we can fund the highest priority. And we refuse to do that. And so, does it have real consequences, what we're doing today? And there's no question this bill is going to pass. There are the votes in this body to pass and add another $60 billion. What are the consequences? Well, the consequences come about to our children. And you've seen this sign before. This is Madeline. And this photo was shot of Madeline as she walked around Capitol Hill. I actually got a visit with her and her parents. When we first put this up here, she was only $38,000 in debt. That's less than 6 months ago. Less than 6 months ago, she only owed $38,000 per man, woman, and child in this country. She's at $42,000 now. And when we finish what we do before July 1st, she'll be close to $50,000. Per person, in this country. And if you extrapolate what the budgets are going to be over the next 8 years, she's going to be close to $200,000 in debt. And that doesn't count the unfunded liability. When this little young lady is 28 years old, her responsibility, both in terms of debt and unfunded liability, will be $1,113,000. We never think about it in the terms of the young lives and how we're impacting them. We can always rationalize away the ability to make hard choices. And that's what we're doing. Does anybody in this body not think that we couldn't squeeze $60 billion out of $3 trillion? Could we not do that? Are there things less important than fighting the war? Are there things that are more important about our future and less important about irritating some special interest group because their program didn't get funded? Which is it? You know, I vote with the kids and the grandkids. They supposedly have a voice, except we routinely ignore it. And that's what we're doing with this bill. I'm not saying we shouldn't fund the war. I'm not saying we shouldn't create the money for FEMA for the projects that we need. I'm not even saying we shouldn't help Haiti where we can. What I am saying is that we ought to pay for it by making the hard choices that every family in this country right now is making. They're having to make choices between what is an absolute must and everything else that's not. And they don't have the luxury of going unlimited debt service because their credit card companies already said, no, you can't have any more. Their banks already said, no, you can't borrow anymore. Their house and its equity has been maxed out. They don't have any other choice. So they make the hard choices. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we have another choice. We don't have another choice. We're just delaying the time at which we make the choice. And the pain associated with delay is going to be twice as great as the pain of doing it now. So myself and John McCain, Senator McCain from Arizona, are going to be offering these two amendments. And the whole purpose for the amendment is to give the body a couple of choices on how to pay for this. It's not easy. It's not fun. But is it necessary? Is it necessary for the health of our nation? Is it necessary that we start acting in the way the American people expect us to act? Which means we're going to get rid of the things that are not as important as the things in this bill. Now, I understand that's novel because the Congress has only had one net rescission in the last 16 years. And it occurred with the 1996 appropriation bill, where we actually cut total government spending in 1996. We had the will to do it. The appropriators had the will to do it. But we don't have that will anymore. And the environment we face as a country is 3 or 4 times more severe for our future than it was in 1996. So what is the disconnect? What is the disconnect that we won't make hard choices? And I'm not going to say my choices are the best choices. They're just my choices. But it ought to be rolled back to the appropriators that this bill should have never come to the floor unpaid for. They know more about spending than anybody in this body. And they are more qualified to make the cuts. But they chose not to make the cuts in lower priority items to pay for this bill. And so what's that choice? What is the choice with that? The choice is to indenture our children and grandchildren. That's the choice we're making. When we choose not to do it, we're choosing proactively to indenture our children and grandchildren. We're better than that. We're better than that. What is so sacrosanct? Do you realize that in 2 weeks in December, we found 640 sets of duplicate government programs that had exactly the same goals with multiple sets? 70 programs for food and nutrition for hungry people. Why do we have 70 programs to help poor people get food? Nobody can rationally explain why we have it. We just have it. And the reason we have 70 is because we used to have 40. And we didn't have any metrics on it, so somebody thought we ought to have another program for feeding hungry people. So we put another program in, and then we funded it. But we didn't have any metrics on it, so then we did it again. And we continue to do it. There's 640 different instances just like that. 70 programs to feed the hungry in this country across 6 different agencies. Not just one, but 6 different agencies. None of them with metrics. None of them working to see if they actually work. No oversight hearings by the Appropriations Committee to see if they work, or the Authorizing Committee to see if they work. So we have 70. There's 105 to incentivize kids to go into math, engineering, science, and technology. 105 programs that cost 9 agencies. And that's just 2 examples out of the 640 sets of duplications that we found. When are we going to eliminate some of that? When are we going to accomplish what the American people are asking us to do? It's not about eliminating food for the hungry. It's not about eliminating incentives. It's about eliminating management structure for 70 programs or 105 programs so you can have 1 or 2 good ones and you can have metrics on it. I would yield to the majority leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I appreciate the courtesy, my friend. I have 2 cloture motions at the desk. Was asked they be reported.
The clerk will report the motions.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the committee-reported substitute amendment to H.R. 4899, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for disaster relief and summer jobs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2010, signed by 17 senators.
Does further reading of the names be waived?
Without objection.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on H.R. 4899, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for disaster relief and summer jobs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2010, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask the names not be read.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Well, there we have it. We have cloture now filed on a $60 billion bill that I don't know what the intentions of the majority leader are, but the fact is we're gonna limit debate. We've been on this bill as of now about a day or a day and a half, $60 billion, and we're going to cut off debate. We're going to attempt to limit the amendments, and we're going to limit the debate. And this is a debate this country ought to be having. This is an opportunity for us to do what the American people want us to do. So 30 hours from now, we're going to have a vote on cloture on this bill, and then we also had the cloture to end debate filed as well. So what does that mean? That means the American people aren't going to get to hear everything that's in this bill. 1. That means there's going to be a very limited number of amendments that are going to be actually voted. And so we're going to do by rule, we're going to close off our responsibility to Madeline. We're going to say, Madeline, you don't count. We got to get out of here. Don't you know? Memorial Day vacation's coming. So we don't want to be here as part of it. We got Codell's leaving Saturday morning. That's got to be more important than saving the Republic so we don't end up like Greece. And you know, we're only about 4 or 5 years behind them. Let me say that again. We're only 4 or 5 years behind Greece. We're going to see this tremendous money flow come into this country because people are worried about Europe. And you're going to see it come in from Japan because people are going to worry about Japan being able to pay their debts. And we're going to feel all good and fuzzy for about 2 years. And after they either inflate their currency or debase it, or they default, the money's going to flow right back out. And guess who's going to be looking over the abyss? The United States of America. Because we're going to be in the same point. What is the problem? The problem is their spending as a percentage of their GDP creates an environment where they can't pay off their debt. That's exactly where we're going to be. And if you're honest in the terms of your accounting, my first degree was in accounting. I had a business career for 9 years before I went to medical school. And I can tell you, if we truly accounted for the liabilities of this government, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which we refuse to recognize their liabilities, our debt would be far in excess of $13 trillion. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the senator's comfort is much more important than Madeline's future. Let's talk for a minute about what the word indentured means. That means you're under the control of somebody else. Your ability to have free choice becomes limited because you're indentured. Is there any wonder why we have trouble bringing hardcore sanctions against Iran when the Chinese own $900 billion of our debt and the Russians have $800 billion? Our debt affects our foreign policy. Our ability to support our military is jeopardized by the very fact that we're making a decision today to pay $33 billion for the war effort in Afghanistan by not paying for it. We're jeopardizing our long-term future. You know, the other ironic thing that's in this bill, this body just passed a financial regulatory reform bill. But we created a commission called the Financial Inquiry Commission. And in this bill, we're appropriating on an emergency basis $1.8 million for that inquiry commission who's going to give us what went wrong and what we need to do about it in December. And we've already figured out we don't need them. We passed the bill without that knowledge, without that look, without that in-depth analysis of what went wrong, because we had to get it done. Yet we're going to continue to fund a financial inquiry commission that we're not going to do anything with the results of? And we're going to call it an emergency? Man, how ludicrous is that? The whole purpose of the Financial Inquiry Commission was to guide Congress in what to do. We've already ignored them. We've already decided what we're going to do. That bill's in conference. So we're going to ultimately pass a financial regulatory reform bill that is devoid of the recommendations of that commission. But we're going to do the typical Washington thing. We're going to continue to fund the commission, even though we're not going to use its results. And why is that? What does just $1.8 million out of a $60 billion bill, what's that mean for her? And then multiply that times thousands of times every year. The stuff that we're doing that isn't a priority, nobody can agree that that's still a priority, that we ought to borrow $1.8 million to fund that commission. You can't argue that that's still a priority because we've already made up our mind on the financial regulation reform bill. But that happens thousands of times a year here. Billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. These two amendments are tough amendments. And I'm not deceiving myself to think that all of a sudden grown-ups are going to show up in the Senate. They're not. But let me tell you what they do. The First Amendment will reduce our own budget. We gave ourselves a nice stellar raise, not salary-wise, but for our own budgets. And we're going to reduce that budget for members of Congress. We're going to disclose on the Senate website the cost of borrowing money and how many times we violate our own rules, pay-go. There should be nobody who voted for pay-go who votes against that, because if it's good enough for us to use, it's good enough for the American people to see. We're going to dispose of unneeded and unused federal government property, whether it's military, whether it's buildings, whether it's land, things that we don't use, don't need, but we're spending $8 billion a year taking care of. We can get tremendous savings from that. That's what any other right-minded person would do. They get rid of the stuff they're not using so they don't continue to send money down a rat hole. And we're going to rescind uncommitted and unspent federal funds. We have hundreds of billions of dollars sitting that aren't even in the pipeline. And we're going to borrow more rather than more efficiently use the money that we have. And that's the First Amendment. It's $60 billion, $60.5 billion. The Second Amendment is $59.6 billion. It's a one-year freeze on bonuses and raises and other salary increases for federal employees. They make 45% more than everybody else in this country doing exactly the same thing, on average. We're going to cap the total number of federal employees. We've added 180,000 federal employees in the last 18 months.